and welcome to Happy You Asked, the podcast where we explore joy one awkward conversation at a time. And I'm your host, Erin Clare. Today I have with me Dr. Tim Lomas, who is a psychology research scientist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and part of the Human Flourishing program at Harvard University, which he joined in 2021. Tim's main research focus is exploring cross-cultural perspectives on well-being, including being project manager for the Global Flourishing Study, which is a longitudinal study of 200,000 people in 22 countries. Also co-leading the Global Wellbeing Initiative, which is in collaboration with Gallup to develop and analyze new items for their world poll that reflect non-Western views of well-being. And creating a lexicon. I already messed it up, and I'm an English professor. Lexicography. Is that close enough?
That's good. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
It's too
Of
much for me.
un
We need a better word. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Let's come up with something easier. A thing of un untranslatable words relating to well-being, which is also a very cool project. So before entering academia, Tim spent 7 years as a professional musician while also working part-time as a psychiatric nursing assistant. Fascinating. Tim completed his PhD at the University of Westminster in 2012, where his thesis focused on the impact of meditation on men's mental health, combining cognitive neuroscience, narrative, and ethnographic analysis. From 2013 to 2020, Tim was a lecturer in positive psychology at the University of East London, and since 2013, Tim has published over 150 papers and 15 books relating to well-being, involving topics, approaches like linguistics, semiotics, art, nature, emotional dialectics, balance, harmony, systems theory, social theory, politics, gender, and Buddhism. I'm tired just from all this. I'm exhausted. His latest solo book, entitled, of course, Happiness, as it should be, was published in 2023 by MIT Press as part of their Essential Knowledge series. Welcome, Dr. Lomas. Welcome, welcome. We all feel inadequate now because of your
Hopefully. Hi,
accomplishments.
Erin. Thank you. I think that's too much. I should edit that down. That sounds.
No,
Um.
it is, and it is not even everything. It's just you're amazing.
uh,
You're amazing.
oh, thanks so much. Likewise, it's great to be with you. This is it's always nice talking about this kind of thing. So, uh,
Yeah.
thank you for
Well,
inviting me.
everybody gets the same first question, which they all hate. What is your definition of happiness?
Oh man. Actually,
Yeah,
no,
it's
I
a
do have
good
an
one
answer
for
for this.
you. Wrote the
Because
book
I
on it.
try and think. Yeah, no, we did try and put one forward, and I tried to put one together that would make sense for this book, and just really expansive and broad and sort of generic, but a mental state of quality.
Hmm.
And that's it. So anyway, there's lots of reasons behind this. One of which I love the idea of quality. So
Hmm.
probably my favorite book is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which I'm guessing you've read,
Yeah,
hopefully. It's
I
like
have. Of
something
course I have. Love that book.
it's, like it's amazing, and I've read it so many times. But central to that is this idea of quality, and just there's an irreducible sense that something is good and desirable, and that's really interesting. Like, what is quality? So then I was trying to think about well-being as just states of quality across different dimensions of the person.
Mm.
And there's like physical health, and so that's kind of physical quality, and there's social quality, and there's spiritual quality, and then I just wanted to use happiness for the whole mental realm. So not
Mm.
having a narrow view of happiness that it's just like joy or pleasure, or there's different, obviously different types of happiness people identify, but just use that word for the whole terrain of mental experience, states of quality. When you say you just want your kid to be happy, covering all of
Yeah,
those things. So I just
yeah.
it's like this big then expansive canvas where you can think about all good stuff as it pertains to the mind and psychological functioning, and then just like call that happiness, and then have different qualifiers. So this can be hedonic happiness, but
Mm.
eudaimonic happiness or meaningful happiness, or you know, with my director at the Human Flourishing Program, Tyler Vanderweel, we did a taxonomy of 16 different types. Some are pretty niche and not well recognized. Some are just the main ones you often hear about all the time, like hedonic or eudaimonic. But even that 16 doesn't have to be exhaustive. You could think of other types. We had,
Mhm.
yeah. So I wanted to have this big canvas to
Mm.
consider all these possible states. Because when I was writing the book on happiness, because MIT got in touch and they said, would I do a book for them? I was like, that sounds great. Like, I'd love to. But then I wanted to really to have this wide remit to focus on anything that seemed good and desirable when it comes to the mind and well-being, and then just to call that happiness, just have this expansive word for it. So
Yeah, I
how's
like
that
that.
for an
It's perfect. What makes me really happy too, it don't happy is that I've talked to all these experts, right? And nobody's had the same definition. They've all had great definitions, but never the same one, which means I need to keep talking to people, right? Nobody
That's
has
cool.
it.
I love that, yeah. And
Yeah.
I also think there doesn't have to be one definition. It's so there's so many different ways of looking at it, different perspectives. So like another researcher I really admire and been influenced by, probably the main influence in my academic career. He's a philosopher called Ken Wilber. He's a little bit unorthodox, you might say, but
Mhm.
he's like amazing. And I encountered him during my PhD and just was completely captivated, and it kind of changed how I thought about PhD, but just you know, psychology and academia generally. But then he has this view. He's really good at synthesizing and bringing together just different perspectives, and he has this view that, like, barring some things that are just like terrible and actually wrong, most things are not wrong, but just everyone has like a piece of the puzzle. Everyone's right about in a little respect, and they're only wrong when they assume they have the whole picture. So
Mm.
if you were to say, who's right or wrong, behaviorism or existentialism or psychoanalysis, people are like, well, it's not really that. They're each capturing some truth about
Mhm.
life and the person, and they've each got their own role, and they only go wrong when they say they have the whole picture. So if someone would say, well, it's all about, psychoanalytic principles or all about behaviorism, then I think that's flawed. But he's saying there's like a role for everything. So
Mhm.
his work just brings together all these different theories and models about the person and tries to find like a place for all of them. So I just love that approach.
Yeah,
And you can take that with
I
like
like that
happiness
too.
or well-being, like all these different theories, and we don't have to say which is right and which is wrong. Just work out the correct place for them to occupy. Like what's the truth they're contributing, and then it's true but partial. So anyway, I like that way of just. Then you don't have to be selective, and it doesn't have to be one definition or another. There's like a role for all of it.
Well, I remember, this reminds me, I remember when my kids were little of telling them, when they go to that stage where they're sort of know-it-alls and saying, the person who knows the least is the one who claims to know everything. Because the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. And so
Totally.
yeah, so you sort of have to look at that everything as it could be this, but it could also
Yeah,
be more.
totally. Yeah, like most people, have a piece of the puzzle and just not the whole picture, and it's quite nice having that attitude because then when I don't know, reading people's papers or seeing them give talks, I can be like, it doesn't have to be adversarial, as in, well, if they're right, then I'm wrong, or vice versa. It's just we've each got some aspect of the truth here, and to get like then together, it's all gonna create one big picture that's gonna make more sense.
I'm going to go back though, because that little tidbit about you being a musician, what type of musician were you?
Well, oh, this is a long story. Well, it's this. The short story is we were a ska band. I don't know if you know ska music.
I
It's
do know
like,
ska. I graduated in the 90s. I know ska.
yeah, it's amazing. It's like proper party music. But it became this real, um, I guess, subculture in Britain when because ska is kind of fast reggae, and then it came over to Britain with the waves of immigration, and it kind of mended, kind of merged with punk, and then became this whole scene that's quite specific. And actually, weren't really along those lines. We much more wanted to sound like take the ska rhythm, but sound like the kind of European types of ska, like Manu Chao,
Mm.
if
Mhm.
anyone would know that. Um,
No,
so
never heard of it.
yeah, so we were like a small four piece, but we all sang and we had a trumpet player, and it's kind of
What was
um
the name of your band?
big hand. I
Big
terrible
Hand.
name. Big Hand. If you search for it, you'll probably come up with a Cure song because they have a song called Big Hand. That's not us.
Mhm.
So it's called just Big Hand, and I never actually liked the name, but the music's so much fun, and we did like a whole bunch of albums and tours, and I loved it. Speaking of
Mhm.
happiness, given your podcast, like it's happy music, but then you see people having a happy time and just dancing
What
and
were you
having
in the
fun.
four piece? What'd you do? Singer?
Singer and guitar. And the drummer also sang. We kind of alternated. He was a bit like Don
Mhm.
Henley, but then we alternated and did harmonies, and I also wrote the songs. I kind of wanted to write songs a bit like Queen. This is going to sound random and sounds terrible, but it was honestly quite decent. But write songs like Queen or something, but play them in a ska style with a four piece and
I
a drum.
like that.
So anyway, it was
Mhm.
it was so much fun. I loved it. And you got to have all these adventures and such a tight group of people, and then you play places and make lots of friends, and my family and friends would come to gigs, and you'd play parties and festivals. Like it was, yeah, a really special time. I'm glad I did it. I
Mm,
mean, I say professional. We hardly made any money. I mean, like enough to sort of get by on, and I had to top it up with also working in a psychiatric hospital, as you mentioned.
mm.
So it's like it's really hard to make any money doing music properly, but you had to give it a go, you know. So we thought just for our 20s we'll do it, and then eventually we thought we got to get proper careers. So,
Well, do you
but
still
it was
play at
great.
all?
Well, not really. I'm trying to get it back going. Um, I just played to my daughter. We have a daughter. She's nearly 5, and
Oh,
she's like my main audience. But I am trying. We moved to Seattle in 2020, and then, well, then obviously lockdown. I thought I would come here, and then, it's got a great music scene here, so I was
mm,
hoping I'd come here and play. But then obviously lockdown happened, and then also having a kid. But now, she's a bit older now. I'm starting to think I
yeah. Well,
can
those
get back
first
out
5
and play
years are
music.
brutal.
Yeah. But like I do miss it. I love playing music, so I'm going to try and get back and do some more gigs.
Yeah, but that's the nice thing when you have stuff you love like that. Because a lot of things when my kids were young, right? Didn't get to do them it much, but then all of a sudden you get to do them and they become new and different and it's like
Totally. Yeah.
more complex. So it's something to look forward to me. And I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I'll get back to that. You got hope, and hope is one of the best things we can have, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's lovely. And it's like such a nice way of bonding. And I'm trying to teach her guitar and piano and get her interested in it. And then, take her to some gigs and then get back into that because it's such a lovely thing to do. I mean, people have their
Mm,
different passions. And music's definitely one of mine. And it's just, I love it on so many levels. So it'd be nice to bring
same.
that back to life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and things might end up a strange way. My son ended up being a jazz piano player. And
Nice.
so I
Cool.
get to see it all through him. And I'm like, ooh,
That's
that's more convenient than
cool.
me having to do it.
Well, it's
He's
lovely. Yeah, it's
brilliant.
such a nice way to connect and see people you love when they're doing that too. And yeah, so
It's such a gift. It
it is.
just
It's
to
great.
be able to enjoy music and
Yeah,
experience it is magical. Now,
yeah,
so you were then you worked as, your psychiatric physician's assistant, and I assume that's how you made the leap over to this world?
yeah, kind of. Um, well, in fact, it was really meaningful work in itself. Although it's hard work, quite distressing at times, but it's also felt very important and meaningful because, not as a trained nurse, but you're just sitting with people on the ward, and there was a lot to that and a lot to process. Because, like I say, it was obviously quite difficult at times, and you're seeing people at their worst and they're sectioned and they're not allowed to leave the hospital, and there's all kind of issues going on. But it was also it felt very meaningful being there and important. Um, and then also, like in a pragmatic sense, I thought, like I did have a sense I'd want to get back into psychology as a career because, my undergrad was in psychology, and then even then, like while the band was going well, I thought this is probably not going to work out as a career. So I would hope to eventually get back, to find a way to do a psychology career. Although to be honest, there was a bunch of years where I felt I'd missed the boat and I was kind of not gonna, that wasn't gonna happen. Um, but I was thinking, could I train as maybe a therapist? And I had put in some
Mm,
applications for that. But then there was also an application. I saw a PhD scholarship advertised to look at the impact of meditation on mental health because it was put together by a team at the University of Westminster, and they'd got
mm,
some money for this PhD scholarship, and they'd conceived the study itself, which was to look at um, the impact of meditation on men's mental health. And the men angle was specific because the main supervisor was a sociologist, so he's really interested in masculinity and gender theory as that relates to well-being. And for example, the idea of masculine norms around toughness and so on might lead to
mm,
men disconnecting emotionally, those kind of stereotypes. But then meditation is a way to reconnect. And then, so would meditation be a way for them to reconnect emotionally, as it were, and develop emotional intelligence and so on? So put together this PhD, and he also worked with a cognitive neuroscientist. So also on, the main angle was qualitative interviews with these male meditators. Um, but then there's also a cognitive neuroscience angle, measuring their people's brainwaves while they meditated and doing some attention tests. And so I applied for that, and I think I was a good fit for that because this is a bit of a tangent. But before I went to university, I taught English in China when I was 19 for
mm.
6 months. So I was in a place called Qingdao, which, if anyone knows cities in China, is such a great place. It's a beautiful city. So and I went there and I traveled around a lot in China and went into Tibet for a bit, and then through that got just really interested in Buddhism, and meditation. And then so through the 20s, I kept kind of reading along on those topics and try and have a meditation practice and thinking I would love to, if possible, try and steer myself in that direction, if that would be possible, doing research on meditation or something. So anyway, when this when this opportunity came up and I applied, and I think I guess, a good fit maybe from those experiences and also, with the psychiatric hospital. So I was really fortunate to get that. And that was my late 20s. Because, like I said, I did feel I'd missed the boat on getting into academia because, a lot of people just do their degree and then dive right in and make great progress. And I hadn't really done much at all. And then, so yeah, it was kind of 28, 29 when I got into starting the PhD. Um,
This story is fascinating. It's like a movie. I'm following along, and now you're in a band, and now you're over here, and now you're a psychic, and now you get this magical boot Tibet, and I mean, all of it.
yeah.
Gosh.
It's all just a lot of kind of meandering and, and I had that quote, was it? Not all those who wander are lost, but then sometimes you do feel
Yes.
a bit lost, right? But then anyway, so I had this sense that when I saw this and I got that, I felt like such a great opportunity, So
Hmm.
so like pleased and felt fortunate to get it, and then just embraced that, and then loved doing that, and then that was
What would they find though? What was the effect?
yeah, like they were totally right in there what they sort of predicted, that
Hmm.
well that meditation had served these purposes for men. So we designed the interview with that in mind. Is like what led you to meditation, what experiences you've had in meditation, how's this helped you with your well-being, and then I don't think I prompted them as especially in this direction, but I just asked them to tell me about their early lives, very open-ended questions like what led you to meditation, and they were saying things like feeling this pressure to be stoic and tough and to to push down their feelings. Like I don't like I say I don't think I'd nudged them or led them in that direction. The questions are very open-ended, but they all came up with these many of them very similar stories about
Mm.
struggling through the pressures of masculinity and how it made them be, and they felt like it was cramping them and making them having to disconnect or not admit to vulnerabilities or issues and so on. And then, like many of them, maybe half of them had some precipitating crisis that made them have to take their well-being more seriously. Like people went
Mm.
to prison or had a breakdown or some act of violence, some often quite dramatic things. And this being like a turning point that then thought they got to, okay, get hold of themselves, do something constructive with their well-being. And then, so, then they had their stories about how they went down to the local meditation center or local Buddha center. Um, but then it was so cool because then the stories are broader than that. So it was also about the value of engaging with the meditation center. So it wasn't just about the meditation, but you know, the center itself was this really interesting community of practice. So there's a lot you could say about the kind of hegemonic gender norms, like in society at large, but then there's different norms in the center. And instead of
Mhm.
like norms around toughness and heavy drinking, whatever, for men outside the center, inside the center, there was these norms of kindness, right, and abstinence and spirituality, like very different set of norms. And also still some interesting gender dynamics. There's like perhaps some coercive, like they feel like they have to be a certain way within the center. So there's still these odd dynamics in relation to how gender operates. But even so, it was a kind of different set of gender norms, different ways of being inside the center. So the broader role of meditation center, Buddhism itself was also really impactful. So you also mentioned in the bio I did a sort of an ethnography, which sounds a bit grand, but really I just I went to the center myself and I went to some retreats with them, and then so part of the analysis was just some observation about what it's like in the center and how that seemed to help these guys and their well-being. So I had these really lovely in-depth interviews, go for a couple of hours. People would just really open up. Then I did the cognitive neuroscience aspect, which was that was okay, but like the men didn't like it because you put this gloop on the head and they have to go through these boring attention tests. So that's
Loop
less
on the
fun.
head.
That's less fun for them, and like it's a bit weird for me just having to wire them up with this portable EEG machine. But it was kind of interesting too, and then trying to triangulate with that with the qualitative data. But the overall picture was that meditation really did help them.
Mhm.
You should bring in some caveats too. I mean, there's issues involved too, and in fact, I did a bunch of papers relating to the PhD, but one of them was all about the difficulties that men had experienced in relation to meditation. Like it's difficult, it can be challenging, there can be some uncomfortable experiences. So it's not to kind of paint meditation as this panacea that's unequivocally good without any issues. Um, so all of them did experience certain issues connected to it, but overall greatly valued it. So I could see, you really see the importance of it in their lives and their well-being. So yeah, it was such a interesting piece of work. I love doing it, and then
Yeah.
being around the centre in East London. So that was great. And then from there, I got a job as a lecturer at the University of East London because
Mm.
they had it was strictly a master's program in positive psychology, and then they combined it with coaching. So it's now positive psychology and coaching psychology, which made sense, because coaching essentially the practical aspect of bringing positive psychology into people's lives. Um,
Mm.
so I love being there. It's a great place, really good, staff and students, and that was
That's
good. So
wonderful.
yeah, I like doing that.
Well, of course, people are especially fascinated with your work on language. And,
Yeah.
English has such a pretty thin vocabulary for well-being, right, compared to a lot of other languages. What's actually lost, do you think, when we can't name something, when we don't have that word?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I got so drawn into that, you know, um, especially as a sort of outsider, because I'm not a linguist, and I'm sure some linguists will probably think, "What's this guy doing?" But I'm really just fascinated in language as it applies to psychology in the field, and there's so many critiques of the field as Western centric, right? And then
Mm.
one expression and one particularly powerful expression and manifestation of that is the fact that English is the dominant language. So it means that the constructs we have to work with, the way we think about well-being, is often through that prism of English. And I don't know if it's the case that English is particularly lacking per se. Like English is actually, compared to other languages, actually quite a rich language in terms of the size of its vocab and so on. But like, even so, there's lots of states lots of words that are unlexicalized, a linguist might say, or untranslatable from the perspective of English.
Mhm.
And untranslatable is a weird concept. And some linguists really don't like it because they might say, well, no word is ever either untranslatable or it's all, no word is ever translatable, perfectly translatable.
There's
But the way
always
I
slippage, as they say in
Yeah,
semantics,
there's all of
slippage.
these slippages and things lost in translation. But I basically used it. There's not like an exact equivalent. So, I could say there's an untranslatable word, and maybe I could describe in English with two or three words. So you can
Mhm.
get the meaning, but it's the fact that we don't have that exact one word equivalent that would make it constitute untranslatable in my kind of framework or my approach. And I just found it was there's so many interesting words out there that fall into that category. The project started actually with, I think it was 2015, and I was at this positive psychology conference in Florida actually. And I stumbled into this one talk by a Finnish researcher, Amelia Lahti, on this Finnish concept of sisu, which was really fascinating. And then, it comes close or overlaps with terms like grit or courage, and so on. But, this was the topic of her thesis, her PhD thesis, and her whole point was it's not reducible to those. It's not exactly the same thing. It has its own kind of networks and meanings and different dimensions to it. And she was also making the point it's really central to like Finnish identity and culture, but also it's not just restricted to that. As in, she thinks it would have universal relevance, and psychology should engage with it and bring it into its lexicon, into its conceptual network as a concept worth paying attention to. So it was a really fascinating talk, and for some reason, I think it just set off a train of thoughts in my head. I ended up having this when I came back to London, speaking with my mum about the conference, and she was asking about it, and then we had this conversation. I was telling her about the talk, and then she speaks a bunch of languages, and we got into thinking about. We just kind of the conversation meandered into talking about other untranslatable words, and then by the end of that conversation, I thought I should just start a collection of these words
Mhm.
because it would just be really interesting in showing the kind of the areas in which psychology is missing out on certain ideas, and as a way
Mhm.
of getting outside that English centric bubble.
Yeah,
So
like if
so
I,
yeah,
I wonder though, if there are two or three words that English speakers would know right now, what would you pick?
wait, say that again, sorry.
If there were like two or three words from the lexicography that English speakers need right now, which would you
That they already
choose?
know or use.
No, no, that they don't use.
Oh man, there's so many. It's so hard
What
to
are
pick
your
a
three
favorite.
favorites?
Well, for some reason the ones that often come to mind are relate to like Japanese aesthetics.
Mm,
Because sometimes um sometimes I divide the words in the project into two really, because some words kind of they name things that you're already familiar with and then kind of lack a word for. But then some other things kind of point towards things that you're not familiar with and you want to sort of find out more
Mhm.
about that. And um, I think partly because of the Buddhist connection and Zen Buddhism in Japan, but there's this just an amazing collection of words relating kind of aesthetic ideals. And they're also interesting because they're quite different from often kind of mainstream Western artistic ideals.
Mhm.
And so people might know ones like Wabi Sabi, which is this kind of weathered, aged beauty. The way you know that you could pick like an old tree in a bleak, kind of bleak landscape, and it's got this like profound beauty to it, and it's something to do with being old and aged and withered, but there's this kind of perfection in that. So there's
Mhm.
terms like that, and
That's a beautiful one.
there's another one like kintsugi, which is interesting. That's also kind of Japanese aesthetic term relating to this art of fixing broken pottery with gold
Mhm.
lacquer. You might know it, right? But
Yeah.
then you fix it in such a way that the kind of cracks are made more evident. They're not hidden, but they're there and accentuated with the gold. And then obviously you can draw these analogies that like that's what makes people special. The way they're you know they have their own flaws and brokenness, but that something about the light shining through that makes them unique in who they are. Um,
Mhm.
so I
Yeah,
just
what's
found
that? Cracks are where the light gets in. That
right,
phrase.
then going right, exactly. And so those kind of ideas, and then so I found, especially looking through these aesthetic concepts, really just eye-opening because they give you, like I say, some words you can think, oh, that's cool. I know the word. I don't know. This comes to mind because we were watching the soccer yesterday. But there's like a word for like having a beer in the sunshine in Danish, and it's like it's useful to have a word, but like I know that's not like a new experience. We know that. So that's not something that's new, and it's just nice to have a word for it. But then, like I say, other things they're perhaps experiences I'd not thought much about or qualities I'd not perhaps given much thought to. I
Mhm.
guess maybe dimly, you have a sense of that kind of phenomena, the tree and the landscape being beautiful, but it's a really nice perspective to have these new concepts to open your mind to these new ways of looking at the world. So
Yeah, it makes the world a
for some
little
reason I
richer.
land on those aesthetic ones in terms of when I'm thinking of like
Mhm.
which ones I particularly seem to want to highlight. Uh, yeah.
So you've done a lot of work thinking about positive emotions. So your book, Positive Power of Negative Emotions, makes the case that like sadness and anger and guilt and boredom all serve adaptive functions. But that doesn't, how does that sit with like mainstream happiness research, which tends to treat positive effect as like the goal?
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Do you know what? I think most people are kind of on board with it, I think, by now, because you know, I've written about the kind of the evolution of positive psychology, and um, it went through phases, and I think the first iteration, the first wave of it, did did make a distinction between positive and negative emotions, but often centered on valence. So
Hmm.
positively valenced emotions would be considered positive more generally in the sense of good and desirable, and then negatively valenced emotions would be negative, and this was the kind of the discourse in the early years of the field, but then once that kind of discourse became established, that created room, a platform to then kind of critique it, to say, well, actually, things can be negatively valenced but positive in other ways, and vice versa. Um, and then, but in a sense, it wasn't exactly a challenge to the first wave. It was just a kind of a refinement of it. And also, I think what's also interesting is many of the people who helped establish the first wave like already had these insights. So like Martin Seligman wrote about these kind of nuances way back, even before launching positive psychology. So it's not that we were saying anything that I think they would have disagreed with, and I think everything followed in the right order, as it were, because I think I'm trying to make the argument that you to launch the field, you had to be have this focus on the positive
Yeah.
before you then got into the nuances. Because if you straight away got into the nuances, then everyone would think, well, why do we need this new field? What's with the label of the positive? And then I think the field needed to establish itself first, then provide a foundation to bring in these more nuanced uh, distinctions,
That
these new,
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
right? Yeah, I think so. So that's why I felt like what we were doing, it's not like we were going against what had come before or saying things that people would disagree with. It's more just, the people like Martin Seligman and others had done such great work in establishing the field. And let's say, initially it was just let's make this focus on the positive. But then
Hmm.
having done that, making such a success of establishing it, then that created the foundation and the kind of platform for then, like I say, bringing in more of these nuances, which, like I say, people like Seligman had already written about, so it wasn't things that were new to them. But then, so I think then people welcome that kind of that iteration, that development, because it spoke
Yeah.
to the insights many people would have. They know that sometimes certain emotional states might not feel good, they might be negatively valenced, but they're still important to have. And I think so. Lots of people kind of chimed with that insight, and then I think that allowed some, more nuance to be brought into the field, and it wasn't just this simplistic thing where, you know, certain emotions are positively valenced and therefore good and worth seeking, and getting away from that binary and creating a bit more of a nuanced picture. So
So for
yeah,
those
we
people who
found it
don't
pretty well
know,
received. Yeah.
so for those people who don't know as much about positive psychology, what's the line really between letting a difficult emotion like do its work versus when it tips over into something harmful? What's that line?
But that's it. I mean, in fact, finding that line is the key, in fact, because
Mm,
because you don't want to kind of enter this topsy-turvy word where negative emotions are suddenly great because A, they can be unpleasant, and B, they can be harmful, especially, they'll tip over and they could tip over in some point into a clinical situation or a clinical diagnosis. But then that is the task, is like working out where is that line, so
uh,
because you mentioned sadness or say anxiety, and certain forms of those are very adaptive and healthy and appropriate, and like other forms aren't. And then, so, I'm not a clinician, so it's not for someone like me to draw that line and know where it should be, but more just the case of arguing for that line being there, as others have
mm,
done, that there is a point in which, certain forms of anxiety very adaptive, they keep people safe and so on. And then, certain forms of sadness, if it relates to sensitivity to the world and to people suffering and compassion and so on. And that's not only kind of appropriate as, as a normal human emotion, but it's actually conducive to well-being in some deeper and broader sense. Um,
yeah. Well,
and then there's
and
also like more, and then just say then there's also kind of versions of sadness and anxiety and other things that are harmful and unwanted, and you wouldn't want to have, and you wouldn't want to say we should just, abide by, and then they can be treated, and then that's I guess, the task is like working out where to draw that line, and I think people are getting better at doing that. So rather than kind of
mm,
pathologizing any form of sadness or any form of anxiety, just to recognize, well, there's certain forms or types that are useful and are needful and are, in fact, are just part of being human anyway. And then other
yeah.
forms that you would want to treat, and that, you wouldn't want to have them. And then, you know, having a kind of more nuanced conversation about where that line is, and then creating space for that in somewhere like positive psychology.
So it seems like it had to be a little more black and white so we could make it gray, which is actually
That's nice.
what
I
things
like that.
are. Yeah.
Yeah,
We had
right.
to
I
blend
like that.
them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And then so kind of see how things, because I'm always quite interested in like, sort of the history and philosophy of science and particular fields and how they unfold and develop. And so it's interesting to see how positive psychology did that. It kind of phases
Mm,
development it went through, and everything kind of went in the kind of the sequence it needed to, I guess.
yeah. Now, the Global Flourishing Study, it published initial results last year in Nature Mental Health and is covering 22 countries. Is there a finding that surprised you?
Oh yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, there's so many findings that could be considered surprising, partly because there's so many items in there. There's like over 100 items in the questionnaire, 22 countries. So, so many things are surprising, especially when you get into the granular level, because the granular level of different countries, because you can take there could be general patterns, just to take, for example, employment, you know, people who are employed have higher levels of flourishing than people who are unemployed. But there's all these interesting exceptions, in certain countries, there will be exceptions to that. Um, but I
Mm,
mean, I suppose in the big picture sense, some of the most surprising ones was around which countries were doing particularly well. I mean, I should, as a preface this with a caveat that we're kind of wary about kind of ranking countries because it's problematic to compare countries,
yeah.
because the items might not be performing identically in different countries. There's issues around translation. So we kind of treat the whole thing as kind of a meta-analysis of 23 different country studies, the same way like a meta-analysis of interventions would not assume they're all identical, but you still look for some common patterns. So anyway, all that is to say, we try to avoid the rankings, and this country is better than that country on a given. item. But like with all those caveats in mind, you can still kind of order countries on their means. And then,
Mm.
when it comes to flourishing, but then also I did a paper that was comparing three measures relating to subjective well-being, like Cantrell's ladder of life valuation, life satisfaction, and happiness, around which countries really seem to excel. And the one that leaps out is Indonesia because that came top
Hmm.
of in terms of the ordered means for happiness and life satisfaction.
Really, I'm
Because there's this,
surprised by that.
right, yeah, it's interesting, right? And I think many people were a bit surprised, because we had this narrative drawn from say the World Happiness Report that the
Mm.
happiest countries are the Nordic ones, and there's good reasons for that. But that's based on Cantrell's ladder item in the Gallup World Poll, which is really interesting. So we had that too in our analysis. We only had one Nordic country, we had Sweden in there, and then when it came to Cantrell's ladder, Sweden was in fact second, so quite high up,
Mhm.
and in fact Israel was top for Cantrell's ladder, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and then Indonesia was like I say only in air quotes, only fifth. So Indonesia was slightly lower when it was Cantrell's ladder. But then when you switch it slightly to life satisfaction, even though many people sort of treat life satisfaction and Cantrell's ladder as almost identical or very similar, there were some really interesting nuances when you compare them. So when you switch it to life satisfaction, Sweden was only mid-ranked, and the same for happiness. And instead, like I say, Indonesia was at the top, which was really interesting. So then you think, what exactly is Cantrell's ladder tapping into? And there's some suggestions that it's much more tapping into things around kind of security and contentment and feeling safe and secure in one's societal situation and so on. Um, and then so the Nordic countries obviously excel in that with this kind of strong, very egalitarian, strong social welfare net and so on. But then, if you tweak the question slightly to ask about life satisfaction, suddenly Indonesia is thriving and doing really well. And then in our paper, kind of comparing these three items, then you just say, well, we don't overturn it and say, well, actually, suddenly before we might have thought Sweden was a better place to live than Indonesia, and now we're going to say Indonesia is a better place. Well, that's not the case. It's because the view of flourishing at the heart of the study is that it's multidimensional, and countries can do well in different ways. And then Sweden is one way to flourish as a society, let's say, and then Indonesia is another. And let's just say they would both have their strengths and weaknesses, and maybe Sweden can learn something from Indonesia and vice versa. As in, maybe there's certain aspects of flourishing that Indonesia seems to excel more, and maybe that's more the kind of perhaps positive aspect or things around relationships and and so on. Whereas there's other ways in which Sweden flourishes in terms of uh, its societal safety net and egalitarian structures and so on. So it just presents a different view of what flourishing looks like, not an alternative one, but just to go back to Wilbur's point, countries can do well in different ways, and that's the case here. That
Mhm.
different countries have their strengths, and like I have this view where each country can, ideally learn from each other, and we can all learn from each other, as it were. But it just, but it gets you away from that singular vision of well, flourishing means looking like a Nordic country when that's
Mm.
not the
That
case.
there's
And
only one answer, and you have to mirror it in your own culture when it may not fit
right,
what you're doing, or even your language, or
that's
all
it
sorts of things.
exactly. That's it, right? And then also I was at the Nordic Happiness Summit in Stockholm in May, and they were talking like they're very proud of their culture, as they should be. It's a great place to live. But they were also, the Swedes there and other Nordic people, saying there's issues with their society. So they wouldn't want to paint it as this, you know, idyllic place that's without issues. Um, but that's what's so useful about a study like this, or initiatives like the Gallup World Poll, where you can just look across different countries on a range of measures and getting away from the single metric, say, Cantrell's ladder, and then looking across countries on different domains and seeing they all have their strengths and they all probably have things they can work on, and
Yeah.
kind of learning from each other in that way. So that was
And to get
really
away from
interesting.
the myth that, something like in Sweden, they're all, bouncing around happy like a Disney movie. They're being human
Exactly.
beings with emotions and struggles and
Yeah,
all sorts of things.
exactly. So you get this much more nuanced picture about what it means to thrive and do well. And even with respect to particular dimensions, some of the Swedish people we talked to, they were saying Sweden does very well in terms of social capital, it's a strong with a welfare net and so on. But they were saying it can also be quite a lonely place, and maybe
Mm.
this even with a strong social capital kind of in terms of interpersonal connections, people might be relatively lonely there, or at least more lonely than places like, say, Indonesia. So it's about kind of getting a much more nuanced and yeah, kind of comprehensive and full picture of what it's like in a different place. But then ultimately, you want this to be in a pragmatic way to make a difference in people's lives. Like that's what we're trying to focus on now is we've had the wave one data and now we're actually getting into wave two and wave three so we can do the longitudinal analyses, which is really fascinating too. And then so
Yeah.
we're trying to make sense of the data and get it out there, but then building on that, what's like the policy implications? So we're having some interesting conversations with policymakers because they're like, this is fascinating, but then what's the implications for how we could organize society to the extent that you can pull levers and make things, change how,
Mhm.
the situation is in a given place. So that's what we're trying to do now is work on how to translate the data into actually kind of a bigger societal impact.
Oh, that's useful. We're coming to the end of our time. I only have two more questions for you.
Sure, okay.
Yeah. Now, you studied happiness for a long time now. If you could give one piece of advice to all the people listening, what would it be?
Oh man. So many words just split into my mind just there. Like be grateful, obviously that's one. Make connections, like be outside, enjoy nature, travel. I mean, obviously this depends on people's abilities and resources, and some people can't manage that, and that. But like to the extent that people can, be grateful for what one has. I mean, these are obvious things. They sound like truisms because they are, and people know them. I guess the thing is acting on them because
Mhm.
you often find happiness researchers often don't always seem like the happiest people, and it's like people you might know things abstractly, but it's the question is like how to actually do them. I mentioned meditation, for example, and I keep trying to follow meditation practice, and I think that's really valuable. And with that caveat, with that caveat that it's not going to be necessarily beneficial for everyone, I do think it's generally pretty beneficial. But even me knowing that and researching it, sometimes I still struggle to just sit down and do a meditation setting, and so that's
Same,
interesting
same.
too, right? So that's strange and a strange factor of our feature of our human psychology and motivation. But it's almost like the recipe for happiness is like people often just do know it, but then it's getting oneself just to act on it. So
Yeah.
I'm not
Like
even sure I have any
exercise.
answers for that. Yeah, like exercise, people know that will probably make them feel better, and I'm not even sure I have necessarily answers to that, other than to say try and make a routine of it, of a habit of it.
Yeah.
The way things become automatized, like brushing one's teeth. If there's a
Mm.
way to make things into a habit like that, that can be good, I think. But this
Well,
is
it's
probably,
perfectly lovely
yeah,
advice.
yeah.
And then last question, which is also the one that people love or hate, and it's you get to add one song to the Happy US playlist. Any song in the world.
Oh man, that's so hard because there's so many songs I love. I'll say this one actually because this is quite random. People might not know it because there's obviously ones I can name any number of Beatles songs that everyone's going to know. But there's a classic. I'm not even particularly into classical music, but there's one called Spiegel im Spiegel.
Hmm.
Um, like means mirror in the mirror, I think. By Arvo Part. He's Estonian, and
Okay.
this is the most amazing kind of transcendental piece of music. It's so simple. It's just these kind of arpeggios with these long ascending notes. But if people listen, if you've not heard it, it really is one of the most amazing pieces of music I've ever heard. So that's one I would point people to
Perfect.
in case they've not heard it.
I'll I'll listen to it right away, right
Nice.
after.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough. This has been fascinating, and your research is amazing, and your life too. And now
Oh, thanks so much.
I want to know this album though. When it comes out, I'm gonna get a right of your album. I want a copy,
Yeah,
okay?
definitely, for sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And
It's
say,
great.
you encouraged me, Aaron. It's all you. Just give it all to
I
me.
will.
It'll be fine.
And now
Just for a second.
you're into Scar and dancing away, so it's great.
That's, that's right. And thank you everyone for listening. I'm so grateful to you. Just Tim told me to be, but also because it's good practice. All right. Thank you again,
All
and
right, thanks.
see you next time.
See
Bye.
you soon.